Shalom to everyone and welcome back to part 2 of the book of Judges, the book Sefer Shoftim. So the book of Judges is not the story of Israel's victories. It is a story of how people slowly forget who they were. So the book tells the story of a nation that possesses the land but then slowly loses its resolve, its commitment. And as the people decline spiritually, so does their leadership. So we are reminded in the Sefer Shoftim, the book of Judges, that a society does not collapse overnight. It collapses when the shared moral authority disappears among people, among the nation, and everyone becomes basically their own standard. So in the teaching outline, we said that we had to discuss Shoftim, or the book of Judges, in various parts to really understand the book in its entire setting. So in part 1, we saw where Shoftim really ends up with the moral, social, and spiritual collapse. And in this teaching part 2, we are going to take a step back and really ask a harder question. Why was this collapse inevitable? So Judges does not begin with rebellion, it begins with compromise. So before we complete the study of the book of Judges, and the judges themselves, we are in part 2 going to examine the soil from which these judges then arise, or the soil where the roots of the failure basically originates from. So we saw that in chapters 1 and 2. Judges did not begin with chaos, but with an almost success, with an almost obedience, which becomes this soil for future bondage. And then in chapter 2, functions as this theological introduction to the whole book, where Israel doesn't lose the land, they actually lose their commitment. So Judges then really opens not with rebellion, but with a near success. And obedience stops short of completion, and compromise really quietly takes root. So then again, chapter 2 then provides this framework for this whole book, where Israel never lost the land God gave them. But what they did lose was their commitment to live faithfully within this promised land. And then the consequences was not an immediate judgment, but a slow erosion of their covenant identity. So when we look at the book of Yeshua or Joshua that we previously studied, we'll notice a continuation between the chapters in Joshua 15 and then in Shoftim, or the book of Judges, in chapters 1. And if we compare this text in Joshua 15, verse 13 to 19, and in Judges 1, verses 10 to 15, we'll see that there is a similarity actually in the text itself, that these passages are not just similar, but they are intentionally parallel in places nearly verbatim, both in the Hebrew structure and in the narrative structure, or the narrative sequence as well. So if we look at the side-by-side similarities, we're actually going to see that there are the same characters that we see in the book of Yeshua and then in Shoftim, which is the Kalev, the son of Yefuneh, or Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, Othniel ben Kenaz, or Othniel the Kenizzite, Achsa, Kalev's daughter, the Anakim, which then is named in the first chapter of Shoftim as Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. And this similarities, side by side similarity, immediately then gives us this immediate signal of continuity between Joshua and Judges. So we find similar locations like Hebron, Kiryat Arba, Devir, Kiryat Sefer, the Negev, which is a dry land needing water. So we find that even in the geography is identical. And this is same in the inheritance story. So we can see in the same narrative flows there are between these passages in Joshua and in Judges, Shoftim, where Kalev takes on Hebron, the Anakim, the Anakites are driven out, Devir is attacked, and then Kalev offers Achsa as a reward, and Othniel captures the city. And Achsa then asks for land and water, and Kalev gives an upper and the lower springs then to Achsa. So these similarities between the chapters 15 and Judges chapters 1 is not coincidental. It is actually a deliberate repetition in order to highlight a continuation, and not as we sometimes would read, specifically when we break down the parashas over the year, that we segment it and we forget to read it in the bigger story. And this is exactly what Yeshua and Shoftim are binding each other, that it's a continuity of the story of Joshua. So why repeat the story of the book of Joshua at the beginning of Judges? And we'll see is because Judges, Shoftim, is really anchored in the book of Joshua. So Judges does not begin just in a vacuum, but by repeating a Joshua era success story, the writer of Judges is actually saying this story continues, but something is about to change. So Shoftim is not about ignorance of God's will, but it's about forgetting a model that have been given and already worked. We'll further see that Kalev then in this repeated story in Judges represents really then covenant faithfulness, because Kalev is the one who trusted God fully, as we saw in the book of Numbers chapters 13 and 14. And Kalev is the one that completed the conquest, that passed on his inheritance correctly. He honored the covenant order, and by opening the book of Judges with Kalev, the reader then is reminded full obedience was possible. God's commands were not unrealistic, and this really removes any future excuses Israel might have for their failure or their erosion of faithfulness. So further on, we'll see that Othniel is really a bridge figure. So Othniel appears in Joshua, in the book of Joshua, as a faithful warrior. In Judges 3, we'll see that Othniel is the first judge. And this repetition then connects then Joshua to the judges era. It shows that the judges begin in a Yeshua tradition, which and then highlights the decline that follows. So Othniel really becomes, as we might say, the high water mark, the highest point that that will mark the faithfulness. And from here onwards, in the book of Judges, we will see how this uh, watermark really then erodes and slowly falls with the leadership of the judges. And then what we also see is that Achsah and the springs are really a covenant imagery. So Achsah and the springs is not trivial. This Achsah's request is not trivial, since it's not it's a land without water, and survival under this condition is actually is going to be very difficult in a survival failure. So springs then represents life, blessing, and continuity. And this reminds us what the Torah says, is that you will live by this, that Torah is man's life. And without the living waters of the Torah, without the living waters of the scripture, it's an absolute survival failure, as Achsah would then, the story of Achsah would represent in the book of Judges. So the scene of Achsah shows then also the proper inheritance, the secure future, and then the covenant blessing functioning as it is intended, as it was given under the covenant conditions. And later in the book of Judges, we are going to see something unique, where this land is stolen, women are abused, and this inheritance collapses. So the story of Achsah is going to be a contrast that is really intentional and tragic. So we see that the repetition of these stories play a major role in setting the scenes for the rest of the book of Judges. So why does this really matter when reading the book of Judges? So Judges is not just a story of sudden collapse, but by repeating Joshua chapter 17, Judges tells us that Israel did not fall because they didn't know better. They fell because they stopped doing what they already knew. And this will reframe the entire book. Judges is a book of memory and loss. So the repetition functions like a mirror. So remember when obedience worked. Remember when inheritance was protected. Remember when faith produced stability. And then we find this answer in the book of Judges. Now look at what happens when your commitment, your resolve is actually then lost. And then we see that this repetition is going to be a removal of any type of blame shifting. So Israel, future Israel or Israel, cannot claim that God ever failed, that the command was impossible to keep, that the land was too strong. So the opening scene of Shoftim, then connected to the book of Yeshua, is really going to prove the opposite, that God was faithful, is faithful. The commandment was not impossible to keep, and the land was not too strong. God was there with them. So it will absolutely remove this blame shifting that from the people of Israel's part. So why this still matters to us today is Judges intentionally reuses Joshua to establish continuity. The repetition shows what Israel abandoned, not what they never had. Kalev and Othniel represents the real last echo of a faithful conquest, faithful leadership. So Judges is about loss of resolve, loss of commitment, not a lack of revelation. So really Judges begins by repeating Joshua's success so that Israel's later failure can never be blamed on God, the land, or the commandments, the covenant given to them. Only that they lost their covenant resolve. They lost their covenant commitment. So we'll see this roots of failure then in Judges chapters 1 and 2, showing where each root appears in the narrative and what it looks like and why it matters. And we will see the roots growing directly out of the text in chapters 1 and 2 and not imported from later chapters. That these roots of failure was already in the beginning at the onset of the book of Judges. So we'll see that the roots of the failure of Israel is really the incomplete obedience, their almost obedience, the fact of tolerated enemies, their tribal fragmentation, and then the loss of covenant memory. So we see that Israel's obeys enough to settle, but not enough to finish. And this brings the first root of incomplete obedience. And we see this in Judges 1 verse 19, that Judah takes the hill country, but did not drive out the inhabitants of the plains. In verse 21, Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. In verse 27 to 33, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, and Asher, Naphtali, repeatedly did not drive out the inhabitants. So what is happening with the root of incomplete obedience? Israel does not reject God outright, but they stop short of full obedience. Now this becomes critical, for the land is possessed and they do remember the commandments, but their task is really unfinished. Now why does that matter? Because incomplete obedience creates an unfinished business or unfinished tasks that would become future bondage. So Judges does not begin with rebellion, but with this obedience that stops early. Now the second root, the almost obedience, is obedience that is redefined by practicality and not by covenant terms. And we see this in verse 28 of chapter 1. When Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites, to forced labor, but did not drive them out. So it became almost a practical solution for the nation of Israel at that stage. And verse 30 and 33, Canaanites remained among Israel. So we see here that Israel reframes God's command that from where they have to remove the inhabitants completely to them managing it efficiently. So almost obedience looks like a successful story, because it's got economic benefit, it's got political stability, and reduced conflict, but it still stays an almost obedience. So why does this matter? Why does this influence then, or being part of the failure of Israel? Because almost obedience delays the consequences, but destroys this resolve, this commitment that Israel should have towards a covenantal life. So, what is justified then as a wise compromise really becomes a normalized disobedience in the life of Israel. The third root tolerated enemy is about what God commanded to be removed is allowed to remain. So we see this in verse 21, 32, and 34 that the Jebusites live with Benjamin in Jerusalem. So Asher lives among the the Canaanites, and the Amori presses down back into the hill country. So what happening is here in the physical text itself, it's not, the text does not tell us directly that Israel failed, but rather the language then shifts that and Israel lived among them. So this is really a reversal of covenant intent. So within the text we find, instead of saying that Israel failed in their task, it really gives us an indication that this act of tolerating the enemies was really a reversal of covenantal intent. So what does it matter? What is tolerated becomes then this cultural influence in the lives of Israel. It becomes a religious temptation. And we see then from the history a moral compromise. So Shoftim shows us that the greatest threat is really not the enemy outside of Israel, but the enemy that they themselves accommodated then within. And then we find the root of tribal fragmentation. We see that Israel acts as tribes, as individual tribes, individual people, and not as a covenant people. So the entire chapter of Judges 1, each tribe we can see is demonstrated and is evaluated independently. And we notice in the text that there's no national strategy, there's no united obedience, and no shared accountability. So Israel's identity really starts fracturing. Each tribe decides what obedience looks like. There's no central leadership, no covenantal enforcement, and this really anticipates this refrain in Judges chapters 21 verse 25, where it says that everyone did what was right in its own eyes. So the fragmentation then of this tribal fragmentation then weakens the covenantal memory, the moral authority of the covenant, and also the national unity among the people of Israel. So we see that the spiritual failure begins when obedience really becomes a private and localized matter, not a shared national strategy, not a shared obedience, a shared accountability, but really the fact that verse 25 tells us that each one did what he wanted to do in his own way, in his own eyes. And this really resulted in this root of the nation of Israel starting to fragment into into different parts, into different stories, as we would then later see as we study the prophets and the rest of the books. So the loss of covenant memory then becomes the ultimate root of failure, where faith is no longer remembered, it's not retold, it's not reenacted, and it's exactly what the Torah said. You shall bind it as a sign upon your arm, and let him be a tot of foot between your eyes, as a sign between your eyes. Where this really becomes the ultimate root of failure, where this covenantal uh, this covenantal relationship really is completely lost. And we find this then highlighted in the chapter 2 of Judges, where a generation arises who really did not know Hashem or what he had done. And we see here that Israel starts serving the Baals and Astaroth, and they abandoned their way of their fathers. So this is not an ignorance of facts, that they forgot the covenantal facts, but really it's a loss of a relational covenantal knowledge. So the stories were not transmitted. The covenant was not internalized. It was not a matter of the heart. But as we saw in one of the roots, it's really become a convenient type of thing. We do it as it would please us, and it would be beneficial to us as a people. And the what we see then, this loss of covenant memory resulted in a covenant identity not being formed. So we see this memory loss leads to identity confusion then, uh, imitation of surrounding cultures of people, and this comes ultimately, we want a king like the nations all around us. And then the cycle of the repetition of the failure starts, and this we are going to see then being highlighted again and again in the book of Shoftim. When the covenantal memories fades, obedience collapses quickly. So in short, to link these roots, we see that the roots of their failures are not isolated, but they really reinforce each other. So it's a brick building onto another brick. So the one lays the foundation for the other. So the incomplete obedience then leads to an almost type of obedience, and the almost obedience lays the foundation to tolerate the enemies. And when you start tolerating enemies, you allow a cultural influence, and when you allow this cultural influence to seep within the nation, the first thing that we then see is this fragmentation of an identity as a nation, as a covenant nation. And then we see this tribal fragmentation being a result of this allowing a cultural influence, which then absolutely results to this loss of a shared memory as a united people with a united covenant, a united marriage contract. And this will then be the ultimate foundation where the covenant memory, the covenant relationship, the 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 covenantal identity of the people is completely lost. And this really becomes then the root for the repeated cycles that they're going to see in the book of Shoftim, where they are going to sin, and then they're going to be oppressed, and then they are going to cry to God, and they are going to be delivered. God will send them deliverance, and then there will be some time of rest, and then a complete relapse. So the what we see is, as long as these roots of their failures are presented or are present in their lives, these these cycles will be unbreakable. And this is exactly what the book of Judges wants to, the book of Shoftim wants to teach us, is that if you do not get rid of the root, the cycle is going to continue. And every time it continues, there is going to be a erosion of a, call it a spiritual or spirituality or spiritual life. And this is where the book of Shoftim is going to lead to with Shimshon, with the story of Samson, that he will be the ultimate erosion of Israel's unfaithfulness and their roots of failure. So, in summary, the roots of failure in the book of Judges 1 and 2 demonstrate that Israel's downfall was not due to God's withdrawal, but rather the gradual weakening of their commitment to the covenant, to even an idea of a covenantal relationship, a covenantal life, almost a marriage relationship. And the failure then in the book of Shoftim is not a sudden rebellion, but it is really about a slow forgetting. And this is why some of the things that we read in the parasha, or in the Torah itself, about the feast, about so many things being a remembrance, because we see that a forgetting of a covenantal relationship then ultimately leads to a degradation of a covenantal life, as we would see then in the book of Judges. So in part 3, we are going to look from the roots to the results. So the roots explain the failure, but the judges are going to really reveal the consequences. So in the early Judges, the book of Judges chapters 3 to 5, what happens next is the roots are planted in Judges 1 and 2 and begin to bear fruit. And God raises deliverers, but the cycle has begun. Israel is rescued, yet the heart problem remains. They do not change. The key question moving forward as we study then the book of Judges is, what kind of leadership emerges then from this compromised soil with the roots of failure? And this we are going to answer then as we then study further the book of Judges. So in part 3, we are going to look at the early Judges. Deliverance begins with Othniel, Ehud, and Devorah. And we are going to look at a time of deliverance without a national transformation. And with this, I want to wish each one of you Shabbat Shalom, and may each one of you have a wonderful, restful, and peaceful rest. And may He who makes peace in His heights may make peace for Israel and for all of us. And we say Amen. Oseh Shalom bimrumav, huya Oseh Shalom aleinu, ve'al kal Israel v'yemru Amen.